All right, welcome back to the Hub. It's been a while, but we're excited for today's episode. Morgan, thanks for coming on and spending some time with us.
I'm excited to be with you, Matt.
So let's go ahead and dive right into it. You were this all-star basketball player who, I still think it's funny. We met at EFY, when I first came back from my mission, and we were playing basketball, and you were like, you're the only girl playing pickup, so the EFY counselor, and you were the only girl playing, but you were dominating, if I remember correctly. So
well, I think that might be fake news, but I will take it. That's the first time I've ever been introduced as an all-star basketball player, so I'm gonna take that and run with it.
Well, you're a good player. So, but so you've kind of transitioned to more broadcast journalism. Like, you worked for the Deseret News for a little bit, but now you're the host of the All In podcast. Like, how did you end up? I guess how'd you end up where you are?
Yeah, great question. So when I was at the Deseret News, I had been there for about 4 years, and the opinion editor at the time, his name is Hal Boyd. He now works for BYU. He came to me and he was like, I've got this idea for a podcast. And between you and me, like, I didn't listen to podcasts. So I was pretty in the dark and was just like, okay, yeah, tell me what it is. And he said, we hear a lot about why people are leaving their faith, but we don't hear much about why people stay or why people remain people of faith. And I think there needs to be something to counter all of those voices saying why they're leaving or not choosing to remain faithful. And he said, I would argue that the decision to be faithful is just as deliberate and just as thoughtful. And we just don't hear those stories. It's like a silent majority. And I was like, that's a great idea. Love it. You should totally do it. And he was like, well, I think you need to host it. And I was kind of taken aback because, like I said, I didn't even really listen to podcasts, wouldn't even know where to start. But there's something about when someone expresses belief in you and your capability to do something. And Hal is a brilliantly smart person. And the fact that he thought that I could actually do it, I was like, maybe I could do this. And so we had a girl that worked in the entertainment section at D News who had just come from NPR. And I went to her and I was like, can you help me with this? If we did it as like a side thing, would you be willing to give me some tips and help me produce it? And so we started working on it. We got about 6 episodes in, and then and we got 6 episodes recorded. I shouldn't say 6 episodes in because they never saw the light of day. So we got them recorded, and then Deseret News, the day that it was supposed to come out, they decided not to run it. And their reasoning makes sense now in retrospect, but at the time I wasn't really given a reason. And so it was pretty disappointing. And their reasoning was they were kind of trying to rebrand and kind of reach a more national audience. So leaning into like a Latter-day Saint angle didn't really make a lot of sense. And I ended up like 6 months later leaving and going to Deseret Book. And right around that time, they were trying to start some podcast. And they said, would you be interested in doing this? And I was like, well, it'd be great to have a podcast that actually is heard by a single human outside of those that worked on it. And we started doing it, and that's kind of how All In started, and it's been great. I've learned a ton. We had no idea what we were doing initially. There's so many things that, like, if you know it going into it, those first like 3 weeks of having a podcast are kind of crucial, but we had no idea. So we just like threw it up and tried our best. And anyway, we've had to kind of make up some ground since then, but it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, you guys have been great. Like, I've listened to a couple, not the whole things and not every episode, but it sounds like, you've had some you've had some really like well-known people who've come on the podcast, and I'll want to talk about that later. But Taking a step back and just like a broader shift in the media, I thought is interesting. Like, you always hear a lot of stories about maybe people leaving the faith or whatnot. But you brought up a good point. There's a lot of people who, have questions and like, struggle with whatever church policy or just, like just have questions, but you know, they are backed up against the wall of faith, but they stay there and they stay active and they stay in the church. And it's like, yeah, you don't really hear about those stories either. And that term is silent majority. I feel like a lot of times in media circles, right? I feel like they've seen this shift in the media where it's not about, it's becoming less and less so about challenging people in power and like figuring out the facts, and it's more becoming outlets to explain certain viewpoints or certain like ideology
Yeah.
uh and like not pointing fingers at, in politics, like the left or the right, they both kind of do it, but it kind of erodes a sense of trust when like these institutions that you thought were like, hey, your job's just to kind of report the news, or like, you're kind
Right.
of like the mainstream institution, uh and then all of a sudden it like slowly becomes of like, no, you're just kind of like you're more and more becoming like a think tank, or just explaining policy. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on like, it, like you said, like Deseret News didn't want to lean into like an LDS audience angle. They wanted to be more national, so they were kind of like, well, let's do middle of the road kind of thing. Like, how do you approach, you being in the media, like how do you approach um, being professional and being not allowing your bias to like creep into when you're doing the news? Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. I think, Matt, this is something that people probably don't have any idea just how hard it is. Um, there was some situation, and I wish I could remember what it was, probably about a year and a half ago, where, and it may have been the beginning of COVID stuff. I cannot remember, but um, it wasn't COVID. I can't remember what it was. It was pre-COVID. Anyway, I had a coworker at the time who I love, and he actually no longer works with us, but he had some pretty strong opinions about a certain topic. And I totally respect his opinion, right? But I found myself having to take a step back and ask myself, was what we were putting out there, was it just his opinion, his viewpoint, or was it objective? And I think it's just such a tricky thing, because even in a church, like I don't work with any other kind of content anymore. I only work with church related content, but I do work with written content still. So um even within a space where you are 100%, you know who your audience is, you are speaking directly to that audience, and you're speaking from a place of faith. Even within that, there's so much that varies from person to person and differences of opinion. I mean, even just this thing this morning with the church saying that they were going to donate to vaccine distribution with UNICEF, I said to my coworkers, like, we need to make sure that we monitor comments, because people will be heated about this. And they were, when we did an episode about COVID and with a lady that works at Vanderbilt a few months or a few weeks ago. I think it's been a few months now, a couple months. And she, talked about how she thought that the vaccine was a miracle, and people did not like that. And so I think, regardless, you're going to have differences of opinion. And the important thing is to make it so it's not about you. and it's about representing a collective whole. And for me, that's what we've tried to do with the podcast. Somebody gave me a compliment the other day that I really appreciated. And they said, I don't know how you do these interviews and we never know what your opinion is. Yeah. And that is like probably the best compliment anybody could give me, just because I don't want it to be about me and my opinion. And I want to have some voices that some would consider left leaning and some voices that people would consider right leaning. And maybe in the process, I learn a little bit from both sides and end up a little bit more middle of the road. But I think it's a tricky thing. And even when you're in a space where you're only speaking from a religious perspective, there are strong opinions even within that.
Yeah, totally. Well, you know what they always say in a professional work setting, never talk about religion and politics. And you found yourself right in the middle of both. I feel like.
Yeah, that's right. That's
well,
right.
no, you bring up a good point, and this I really adhere to that philosophy. I really like that. Is like there's you remember there was this reporter who called a bank, which will rename nameless, but they called them the vampire squid. This was during the financial crisis. So his name's Matt Tabini, and he used to write for, I think he used to write for the Times, but now he just writes Substack, has his own like distribution. But he says the same thing. I listened to a podcast where he was on, and he was like, yeah, you know, he's like, I think for, you know, people in the media, and he was talking about politics, but he was like, their political leaning should be kind of a mystery. You know, that way the message doesn't get polluted or diluted from the person who's, you know, reporting or hosting or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like that. Yeah.
I think, sorry to interrupt you, Matt, but I think that's so crucial to the trust that you gain from those that read or follow you. One thing that I've been told, and I don't have like data or anything to back this up, but they say that years ago, people read whatever they were interested in. So let's say you're a Utah Jazz fan, you read about the Utah Jazz, you don't care who wrote the story. But today, we pay a lot more attention. People pay a lot more attention to the personality behind what they're reading. And I think it's because there are certain people that we don't trust. And there are people who have gained our trust over time. And hopefully, I don't know. I guess I hope that I can be somebody that people are like, you know, I may not know what she believes, but I do know that I feel like she's tried to be representative of different perspectives and give voice to those, because honestly, Matt, nothing qualifies me to speak to anything. Like, that sounds terrible. And I'm not saying that to like, well, no, it's true. Like, I don't say that to tear myself down, but I haven't done anything to warrant speaking to these lofty issues, but I can talk to people who have, and I want to hear those people's perspectives, and I'm happy to like occasionally weigh in and give my 2 cents, but not about the issue itself, more so like what they're saying is bringing up for me in that moment.
Totally. It kind of reminds me of when you give like a lesson in church or wherever. Sometimes the teacher gets more, you know, as they prepare the material, they sometimes learn more, get more than, you know, the people actually like teaching, like who are listening to the lesson, because they, you know, yeah, they're doing, they're doing the prep work. They get to talk to, you know, people, and yeah, it reminds me of that relationship a little bit.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's important for us to realize that. I was just talking to somebody last night about this, that questions are a good thing, and exploring things further rather than, I mean, they talk about how one problem with our society is because social media is a curated news feed.
Yep.
We only consume the thoughts of those that think like us. And
Yeah.
when somebody on our Facebook posts something that we don't like, we unfollow them, you know? And I just think we've become so closed-minded, and maybe not even intentionally, but I think expanding your worldview, and I've found the most effective way for me, and the way that I enjoy the most, which is convenient because it's what I get to do for my job, is to talk to people one-on-one. Because you can read on the news stuff about a certain issue, and it doesn't hit home the way that it does when it's the voice of somebody you know telling you firsthand their own experience. And that changes everything, and it has the ability to soften your heart and open your mind, I think, more than the news does.
Yeah, totally. Well, and social media is a little interesting too, because yeah, like you said, it's curated news feed. It's a bit of an echo chamber. But right, the whole design of these platforms is to keep you on, keep you on Twitter, keep you on Instagram, and like,
Right.
why would they show the other side, or a differing perspective? Because then you're gonna, it's more like you'll hop off, and we won't use the service for a little bit. It's like,
Right.
no, just keep giving them what they want. And yeah, that doesn't include searching out, exploring, hearing from the other side, especially hot topic issues. Is like, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit. Thanks for your perspective on the media, and how. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So you've had the opportunity, speaking of talking to people one on one, you've had the opportunity to speak to some people in pretty unique circumstances, in terms of position of faith, but also in terms of position of, um, like, I don't want to say they're well-known figures, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
I'm still jealous of your ability to get courtside seats at a major NBA team, which is close to my hometown. Um, but I guess these people in general. Not saying like some people you have interviewed are not unique or whatever. Everyone is, but like, what have you learned as you've interviewed, and talked to these people?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I just want to say I pull for two NBA teams. I pull for the Jazz and I pull for the Sixers, and one is first in the West and one is first in the East. So things are looking good for us right now. But I also have had the chance to interview executives from both of those teams, and that's the reason that I really love both of them. I love Scott O'Neil, who's the CEO of the 76ers. He and his wife are, somebody said when they recommended that I interview him, they said, I think that you and Lisa O'Neil would be friends. And I was like, yeah, right. Like, the CEO of the 76ers wife is going to want to be my friend. That's funny, but she actually is like one of my dearest friends now. And I'm super grateful that I had the chance to meet them. And then Gail Miller and Ryan Smith. Ryan Smith was not the owner of the Jazz when I interviewed him, but is now. And I think the thing that strikes me about all three of those people is they are not arrogant. They don't act like they're better than anybody else. Gail Miller is one of the most humble people I've ever interviewed in my life. I'd say Scott and Ryan, they both have like a little bit of swag to them. You're like, oh, like I can see how you got where you are, but
Oh,
they also, and Gail, you can see where she got where she is because she's, I think, brilliantly smart. But Ryan and Scott, like I said, a little bit of swag, but they are also so, so nice and would do anything for anybody. I noticed when I went to the Sixers game, Scott walks around the arena and he knows everybody's name that works for the organization and says hi to them. And it doesn't matter if it's like somebody on the janitorial staff. He's like, "Hey, how you doing?" And that is impressive to me. I am impressed by people who are clearly very smart and very successful, but who don't act like they're better than anyone. And I think that's a key to success: humility. And certainly those three people to me embody a certain amount of humility, but also confidence in their ability to do big things and to take risks. And I really admire that. One thing that Gail Miller talked about was wealth. And this is obviously like an interesting perspective because you're talking to someone who is the wealthiest person in the state of Utah.
Right.
And that, I think that's the thing that blows my mind about Gail, is that you would never know it. And she makes you feel like she's just like you. But I think one reason for that is she wasn't always wealthy, and she remembers where she came from. And, most people are not born rich. And the people that I think Ryan, Scott, and Gail all are people who have worked really hard to get where they are. But Gail, when I interviewed her, I said, in your mind, what's the difference between rich and wealth? Because she had said in her book, it's made my life richer in a lot of ways, referring to her experience within the church. And I was like, okay, so if we talk about rich being something that's related to your faith, then what's the difference? Like, how do you determine the difference between rich and wealth? And she said, rich is an expansion of your soul. Wealth is what you have as a result of the things you've done. But to be rich means that you have qualities, you have experiences, you have an expanded heart, you see life in a different way, you see it as a fullness. To me, that's rich. And I just love that, because I think we sometimes become really caught up in the rat race for success. And certainly those things are worth pursuing. But I think I was just listening to something yesterday that said there was a study done where they studied people from like birth to age, I'm going to get this all wrong, but it was like age 80 or something like that. And so some of the people died in that time. But they said that what they found in the study is that nothing, absolutely nothing in life determined happiness like the quality of your personal relationships. So you could have amazing career success, you could have a higher socioeconomic status, you could have, incredible opportunities, you could travel the world, but none of those things measure up to simply having good relationships with those closest to you. And so I think, it's important to keep that in perspective. And I think that's the reason ultimately that these people are successful, is and I know this because, Scott and Lisa, she's told me that when their kids were young, she's like, I would pack them up and I would have pajamas packed and I'd take them to the arena just so they could spend time with their dad. And, so it's not to say you're not putting in the time,
Right.
but you're making deliberate effort to strengthen those relationships, even amidst all the busyness. And we went to a Jazz game in January, and, Ryan had all of his kids there and he was sitting with them in the stands. And I think you see that week after week. And that's one thing that Ryan talks about, is being all in your faith, all in your career, all in your family. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
Well, thanks for sharing those perspectives. I think, Celeste, my wife, she works for Qualtrics, which
Yeah.
Ryan's, I think he's the executive chairman now, but and
Founder.
you can see you can see the success he's had, but also the amount of work and effort, but also he's deliberate in what he focuses on, and and I think that goes back to just kind of our initial point where it's like, hey, like being all in, like is it's a conscious choice and it's deliberately made, um, and it brings rich rewards, I guess, as well. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's yeah. Thanks for sharing. That was good.
Yeah, talking about Ryan, one thing that's funny, when we published his podcast episode, somebody commented, or maybe it was when I posted a picture from that Jazz game. Anyway, somebody commented and said, I still remember my girls took dance from Ashley Smith, and they had a dance recital, and I still remember watching Ryan run around backstage like helping Ashley. And I think they have made it very clear that they're a team, and that makes a huge difference too. And like being the husband that's willing to support your wife even when you've got a ton of things going on. I just think like that's a great example of the kind of person that is successful, because like he said, I think he said in the podcast, said nothing in my life has ever been worth doing or has ever been successful if I haven't been all in.
Yeah.
And I think that's true.
Yeah. My two stories. I don't have a story with the McNeil's, the 76ers family, but when I was living up in Salt Lake, I was playing tennis, up in the avenues, like way above I think it's like a 12th Street or something.
Yeah.
And I saw Gail Miller driving by, and I was like, oh, hey, that's Gail Miller. Like, and she was driving this like early 2000s Toyota, just like, I mean, if you didn't know that was Gail, you just would have been like, oh, that's an elderly lady just driving,
Right.
a car.
Right.
I mean, it was like an old Toyota Camry. It was, and she's like the wealthiest woman in Utah. Is crazy.
Yeah.
And her story is awesome. Just like totally not reinventing herself, but totally, her experience is awesome. So yeah, get a chance to listen to those podcasts. And on All In, they're great. So Morgan, I'm just kind of wrapping up here. Thanks again for taking some time. What advice would you give to people who struggle with well, I won't say struggle with their faith, but struggle with trust in the media? What would you say to people who like have this big distrust for the media? Like what advice would you give to them?
I would say that this isn't really something that I've thought about outside of for myself personally, because I think we all kind of have a little bit of a distrust toward the media currently. And I would say, be mindful of where you're going for your news, and try not to become so settled on one particular network or one particular newspaper, but rather spread the love a little bit, because I think then you can get a little bit, even if it's not a perspective that's like yours, you understand where the other side is coming from. I also think there's some good resources in terms of, what the bias is. I don't know if you've seen like those charts, Matt, that show like, this is more left leaning, this is more right leaning. That's been helpful to me to understand like, okay, if I can hopefully expect a little bit more middle of the road. But I will say this, I still think it's super hard. I think it's hard because, like I said, even when somebody's trying to be middle of the road, sometimes you're just getting one person's viewpoint, one person that works for that organization's viewpoint. And so you really do have to kind of try to figure out, what do I believe personally? And when it comes to faith, that's what we've been told to do. That's the reason the Lord gave us a mind and the ability to think for ourselves. And so I don't think that's something that should be taken lightly, or that we should allow ourselves to become objects that are simply acted upon, right? We should be agents who act, and we should be deliberate in that action. And so while it can be really hard to know exactly what to believe in terms of media, I think that the biggest thing, is trying to gain a broad perspective. And then, if it's necessary, this may sound extreme, but like if it's necessary, take it to the Lord and ask him, like, what is it that I should believe, even about secular topics, because I think he can help us discern what's truth.
Totally. I mean, more on the spiritual side, yeah. I mean, like the the spirit's promised, to guide us in all things if we're, if we let it. And yeah, I've always thought it was interesting, he, you know, serving mission, right? Like you always say, like, well, what's the you don't try to persuade people. You give them the materials, and you say, well, read for yourself and pray
Right.
and find out for yourself. It's not so much a persuasion, more so as here, let me help you get started on this journey of exploration. So
Yeah, which is a pretty unique approach, right?
yeah.
I think most things that's not the approach, but that's, I believe, the approach of God in our lives is like, I want you to figure this out. I want you to put in the work to decide what you believe about certain things, and I'll help you along the way. But I think a good portion of what we gain, what we stand to gain from figuring those things out, is the process.
Right. You learn who to trust. You learn what sources are reliable. You learn, yeah. You learn.
Yeah.
You learn throughout the process.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. Thanks for coming on the hub. Really
Oh,
appreciate you coming on.
of course. I'm happy to have gotten to talk to you, Matt. Great to talk to you again.
Well, hopefully we'll have the 76ers Jazz in the finals. I went to the game a couple of weeks ago when they were out here, and they sat Embiid right like 2 minutes beforehand, so it wasn't
I
quite the
know it.
game
That's a bummer.
I was hoping for, but it would be a pretty epic
It
finals.
would. It would be pretty awesome, I think. So,
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Morgan. Appreciate it. We'll see you.
okay, thanks. Bye, Matt.
Bye.